Worry is not clarity, it's not productivity, and it's certainly not control. Worry is a signal, nothing more, nothing less. It's your mind's way of alerting you to something it doesn't fully understand or feel prepared to manage. But what most people do is confuse that signal with action. They dwell on it, circle it, multiply it, and in doing so, they rob themselves of the very focus they need to solve what's in front of them. You're here because something in you is tired of the spiral. You're here because you've sensed that the cycle of overthinking, second-guessing, and catastrophizing isn't producing solutions, it's exhausting your energy. You're not here to be told to think positive or just relax. You're here because you're ready to move from reaction to regulation. And let me make this very clear. From the beginning, this isn't about pretending problems don't exist. This isn't about suppressing your emotions. This is about building a mental architecture strong enough to hold them, sort them, and transform them into strategic action. The mistake most people make when they worry is that they confuse intensity with insight. They think the stronger the worry feels, the more real or urgent it is. But intensity without clarity leads to paralysis. It floods your system with stress and depletes your ability to think constructively. You might find yourself playing out worst-case scenarios repeatedly, convincing yourself that you're preparing for all possibilities. But in reality, you're rehearsing helplessness. That loop doesn't prepare you, it conditions you to doubt your capability. Let's break it down. When worry shows up, it's a sign of perceived lack of control. Not actual chaos, but the feeling that you won't be able to handle the outcome. That sensation doesn't mean you're weak. It means your mind is doing what it was wired to do: scan for threats, seek patterns, and try to protect you. But protection through panic is inefficient. What you need is organization. A system, a rhythm to your thinking that converts that swirling uncertainty into grounded, rational steps. Now, if you've ever found yourself in bed at night, staring at the ceiling with 1,000 thoughts pressing against your chest, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's not you being broken. That's you being caught in a cognitive traffic. Jam too many thoughts. Without lanes, without signals, without order. That's why structure is non-negotiable. It doesn't take away your ability to feel. It gives you the tools to direct that feeling toward meaningful outcomes. Think of structure like a cognitive architecture, set of internal pathways designed not just to organize your actions, but to stabilize your perception. It's more than a mental grid. It's a filtering system, a way of processing emotional data with precision. Every experience you go through generates raw material: doubt, hope, urgency, hesitation.
Structure is what allows you to take those mental fragments and sort them into categories that make sense. Without it, you're flooded.
Every impulse, every vague concern, every passing discomfort feels like a code red. But when structure is in place, you become discerning. You begin to develop the internal habit of prioritization, not out of cold logic, but out of mental clarity. This clarity gives you a critical advantage, the ability to see what actually matters. When you operate without structure, your emotional response system treats every thought like it's equally important. That's why it's exhausting. That's why you end the day depleted even if you didn't physically exert yourself. Your nervous system has been operating without a filter, but structure restores that filter. It teaches you to separate immediacy from importance. It empowers you to say, this feels urgent, but is it essential? It allows you to put noise in one lane and action in another. Let's go deeper. Structure enables a process of mental triage. You begin each moment not by reacting, but by assessing. You create mental checkpoints. What's mine to solve? What's simply passing through me? What requires more information before I act? This is how internal space is created, not by removing worry, but by assigning it. You stop carrying everything at once and start sequencing. And when you do, something remarkable happens. Worry becomes directional instead of disorienting. It becomes a signal that fits into a process instead of a storm that hijacks your system. Space is the critical nutrient most minds lack. And I don't mean space as in time alone. I mean cognitive space room in your awareness where thoughts can land without becoming dominant. When space is present, you can listen to a worry without letting it decide your next move. You can reflect without spiraling. You can discern without pressure. And that kind of space is only available when you've built a system that holds it. Without this system, you operate in loops. You revisit thoughts not because you haven't addressed them, but because you haven't organized them. And that difference matters. When a thought is tagged, meaning you've scheduled it, documented it, or deliberately delayed it, no longer hijacks your focus. It remains accounted for, and your attention is released to engage elsewhere. That's the economy of clarity. One decision liberates a dozen future ones. With structure, your inner dialogue transforms. The moment you bring design into your mental process, the kinds of questions you ask shift from speculative to strategic. Instead of spiraling in scenarios that haven't happened, you start engineering your response to what is happening. The transition from what if to what's next. It's more than linguistics, it marks the shift from emotional reactivity to executive function. You begin to respond, not just feel. You begin to act, not just anticipate. This is the true power of structured thought. It interrupts mental diffusion and replaces it with intentional redirection. When you train your mind to operate within a framework, uncertainty becomes data. You can observe it, map it, sort it. You move from the terrain of emotional vagueness into operational clarity. And this clarity breeds a new kind of confidence not based in bravado or false certainty, but in the repeated experience of turning disarray into direction. You start believing in your capacity to adapt not because life stops challenging you, but because you've seen yourself organize under pressure again and again. You develop a mental ecosystem where everything has a place. Concerns are captured, not ignored. Decisions are scheduled, not delayed. Emotions are examined, not dismissed. Every part of your internal world becomes subject to intentional care. Ideas are collected in dedicated places, not scattered across devices or forgotten in the stream of daily distractions. Tasks are slotted into time, not left hovering in mental limbo. Emotional responses are journaled, reviewed, spoken, allowed given space to be understood rather than suppressed. Even problems, instead of being carried as mental weight, are filed into structured sequences, diagnosed, assessed, and addressed methodically. This compartmentalization is not a wall, it's a framework. And frameworks liberated, they don't confine. They allow you to feel without losing focus, to reflect without losing ground, to care deeply without collapsing under the intensity of that care. When everything has a space, your mind no longer panics under the pressure of holding everything at once. And with that order comes stewardship, the stewardship of your cognitive energy, the stewardship of your emotional bandwidth. You start treating your attention like the limited and valuable resource it is. You begin managing your thoughts the way an architect manages materials, placing each beam with purpose, laying each foundation with foresight. Your mental life evolves into something less reactive and more responsive, less accidental and more accountable. This level of stewardship doesn't just help you feel better, it builds internal momentum. Each time you assign something its rightful place, you reclaim bandwidth. You reduce rumination, you dissolve indecision. Over time, this creates a rhythmic cadence to your thought that is both clear and constructive. You no longer dread challenges because you have the scaffolding in place to process them. You don't fear complexity because you've trained for clarity. Structure becomes more than a solution, it becomes a safeguard. It protects your clarity from being drowned by noise. It protects your emotions from being hijacked by urgency. It protects your priorities from being redefined by distraction. And in protecting these, it protects your progress. Because when your inner world is ordered, your outer world can align. So yes, assign everything its place, but don't stop there. Revisit that place, refine it, strengthen it, let it grow with you. Because your mind, like any powerful system, needs maintenance, it needs updates, it needs reflection. And the more you treat it like a living, dynamic environment instead of a chaotic stream, the more it will serve you not just in moments of pressure, but in moments of purpose. That is how you evolve your questions. That is how you shift from what if to what now, to what matters most today, and how will I act on it with clarity, not confusion. That is how stewardship replaces stress. That is how deliberate design cancels reactive loops. That is how your mind becomes not a battlefield, but a command center. Eventually, structure rewires your default state. You stop defaulting to overwhelm, you start defaulting to process. And the more you repeat it, the more you trust it. Instead of needing certainty to feel safe, you need clarity. Instead of needing resolution, you need orientation. And from that orientation, you begin to move through your days with less panic and more precision. This is why structure matters. Not because it makes you robotic, but because it restores your power of discernment. It quiets the background noise so your inner guidance can be heard. And in that silence, in that deliberate spaciousness, the fog of worry begins to lift. Not through force, but through form. Not through avoidance, but through alignment. And that, more than any motivational advice, is what reclaims your capacity to live with clarity. And let's be honest, how often have you told yourself, I'm just thinking it through, when really you were just cycling the same thought under a different disguise? That's not problem solving, that's looping. And looping leads to exhaustion, not resolution. You're not unmotivated, you're overwhelmed, you're not lazy, you're unstructured. And the difference between those two is everything. So, When you feel your chest tighten, your breath shorten, and your thoughts accelerate, don't ask, what's wrong with me? Ask, what needs to be sorted? Shift from self-criticism to system creation. Because your mind doesn't need to be told to stop worrying. It needs to be shown how to process that worry into direction, sequence, and momentum. You may not control every outcome, but you can always control how organized your response is. That's the power of structure. It transforms emotional noise into clear signal. It takes that vague, shapeless pressure and reshapes it into manageable actions. And each time you do that, you send a message back to your nervous system. We're not drowning, we're designing. That's what this is about. It's about regaining authorship of your internal world, about shifting from scattered reactions to deliberate responses. And from that place, worry doesn't vanish, but it no longer owns you. You manage it, you direct it. And step by step, it loses its grip on your momentum. The problem isn't that you care too much, it's that you've been trying to care without a system. And that leads to burnout. It leads to spinning thoughts and sleepless nights. But what if, starting today, you made a pact with yourself that no worry is allowed to live in your mind without a written response, a specific action, or a clear boundary? That's how high performers think. That's how they move through stress, not by avoiding it, but by organizing it. They know that worry is a request for clarity, so they give it clarity. They know that when the mind doesn't know what to do, it repeats its own warnings louder and louder, so they quiet that noise by answering it with decisions. Let's get honest for a second. How much of your worry comes from things you haven't written down? From vague timelines, half-made decisions, unresolved conversations, or tasks that live only in your head? That's not a character flaw. That's a lack of process. And process is something you can learn right now. Start by identifying what the worry is truly about. Most of the time, the first thought isn't the real issue. You might say, I'm worried about this project. But if you look closer, what you're really worried about is disappointing someone or not knowing where to start. Once you identify the core fear, it stops being a fog and becomes a point. And once it's a point, you can plan for it. And that's the antidote to worry, planning. Structure, focus, intentional planning. When you sit down and write out your priorities, not everything, just the few things that truly matter, you begin to trade anxiety for strategy. And with strategy comes control. Not control over the world, but over your response to it. One of the most effective tools I ever adopted was born out of the need to reclaim mental territory that had been overrun by indecision and vague fear. The tool is deceptively simple, but deeply transformative. Whenever I feel worries start to build, I stop and force myself to step into clarity by asking specific, targeted questions. The first is this: what exactly am I afraid will happen? Not generally, not hypothetically, but precisely. I look for the real, unembellished version of the fear, not the dramatized version that spirals in the mind when it's left unchecked. This question alone forces the emotional cloud to begin taking shape into something identifiable. Then comes the second question, which is even more powerful. What is one thing I can do today that would reduce either the likelihood of this outcome or its impact if it were to occur? Not 10 things, not a perfect plan, just one clear, tangible action. These two questions together are not about suppressing worry, they are about extracting its message and giving it direction. They convert emotion into engagement. They take the overwhelming feeling of helplessness and break it into a manageable step. But it doesn't stop there. Once I've taken that first action, I ask a third question. What can I schedule right now that will continue moving me out of reaction and into resolution? Because momentum is not just about movement, it's about sustained direction. This is where the process deepens into a method. You start mapping your worries into blocks of time, tasks, and priorities. You turn abstract concerns into structured commitments. You go from circling a problem to engaging with it systematically. And if the worry returns, and it often does, I return to the process. Not as a one-time event, but as a loop I've trained myself to rely on. Over time, this becomes more than a coping mechanism. It becomes a form of personal leadership. You start to see that worry doesn't dissolve because the world gets easier. It dissolves because you've equipped yourself to meet it differently. I also refine the tool depending on the context. If it's a personal issue, I ask, what conversation am I avoiding that would bring this into the open? If it's financial, I ask, what number, action, or plan will make this concrete? If it's a future concern, I ask, what data am I missing that's allowing this to remain a fog instead of a plan? Each variation sharpens the original tool and makes it more precise for the scenario I'm facing. This practice also reshapes how I relate to uncertainty. Instead of fearing the unknown, I look for where my influence ends and my adaptability begins. I stop demanding guarantees and start designing buffer spaces in my life where preparation replaces panic. And I found that the more I use these questions, the more resilient I become, not just emotionally, but operationally. I begin to trust myself, not just to endure life, but to shape it proactively. In moments of intense pressure, I bring the questions even closer. I write them down. I answer them on paper. I externalize the worry and move it from the realm of thoughts into a tangible plan. This act of externalization alone reduces emotional friction. It creates distance. It allows me to see with clarity that the problem is real but solvable. That I don't need to solve everything right now. I just need to begin. What I've learned is that worry is not the enemy. It's a signal. And when respected, not feared, it becomes an ally. But only if it's met with structure, only if it's met with process, only if it's met with the discipline of attention, clarity, and decisive follow-through. And it all starts with those first two questions. What exactly am I afraid will happen? And what can I do today to reduce its likelihood or its impact? From there, I build. And from that place, chaos becomes order, uncertainty becomes strategy, and fear, instead of owning me, becomes a call to action. I now know how to answer. You don't overcome worry by trying to silence it. You overcome it by managing it through structure. Time management, decision-making, prioritization, these are not just productivity tactics. They're emotional stabilizers. They return authority to you. When your time is unstructured, worry multiplies. When your tasks are vague, worry intensifies. But when your day has a plan, even a basic one, you reclaim energy. You regain the ability to move, not just think. Because thinking alone is not progress. Thinking alone, especially circular thinking, is what fuels anxiety. Let's go deeper. Imagine your day segmented with precision, not just into blocks of time, but into intentional roles that your mind steps into with purpose. In one segment, you're a thinker, committed to generating ideas, evaluating scenarios, and outlining plans. In another, you're a doer, fully present in the execution phase, ignoring distractions and engaging fully with the task at hand. And later, you're a reviewer, analyzing, adapting, and refining what was done with calm detachment and strategic focus. This rhythm doesn't just make your day more productive. It transforms how your mind functions throughout it. Without this segmentation, the day feels like a blur. You jump from task to task, reacting to stimuli, mails, messages, demands, interruptions, and in that reactive mode, your mind never anchors. It stays hyper-alert but directionless. When you move through your day without clear boundaries, your brain remains on alert all the time, and no mind can sustain that pace without breaking down into distraction, disconnection, or dread. But the moment you establish structure, not just a list of to-dos, but an architecture of time, you begin to reclaim peace. You stop resenting the day because now it reflects your design. You don't wait to be less busy to feel calm. You use calm structure to be less scattered. That is the mindset of deliberate living. That is how you make time a tool of alignment, not anxiety. Structure is discipline. And discipline is not restriction, it's liberation. It's the invisible architecture behind every choice you make with clarity instead of chaos. When your actions are premeditated, your nervous system isn't living in reactive overdrive. You no longer move through your day in survival mode, putting out mental fires and wondering where your energy went. Instead, you start each hour with a roadmap and end each one with resolution. The weight that you once carried, decision fatigue, lingering guilt, mental clutter, begins to dissolve because structure acts as a preemptive strategy, not just a response. This freedom is not the kind advertised in motivational slogans. It's quieter. It looks like being able to transition between tasks without the internal battle. It looks like going to sleep without reviewing your whole day in frustration. It means your energy goes toward execution instead of interpretation. And perhaps most importantly, it creates internal consistency. You begin to trust that you won't forget what matters. You know that your system is holding your commitments, and when that happens, anxiety loses its leverage. Planning isn't about rigidity. It's about removing ambiguity. When your plan is clear, your mind no longer has to carry the burden of what next all day long. That space, that clarity, opens the door for creativity, strategy, and deeper focus. Instead of reacting to your environment, you begin sculpting it moment by moment. And each of those moments, well used, compounds into results. When you lack discipline, every small task feels like a negotiation. Should I do it now or later? Should I skip it? What if I wait until I feel ready? But when discipline is embedded into your system, those negotiations vanish. The task is no longer a question, it's an assignment. That shift frees up your mind not just for efficiency, but for peace. And peace is what most people are unknowingly chasing when they chase productivity. Time becomes something you master, not something you fear. It stops slipping through your fingers because now it flows through your decisions. When time is a resource, you don't resent it, you respect it. You treat it with intention, you give it direction, and it begins to return that investment in the form of measurable progress and untapped potential. This is what makes the disciplined person so centered. They aren't frantic, they aren't overwhelmed. They've learned to design their day before it designs them. And this design becomes a habit. It becomes part of who they are. Not someone who's busy, but someone who's anchored. Not someone who's drowning in effort, but someone who's guided by clarity. So when I say that discipline is freedom, I'm not talking about grit alone. I'm talking about structure that removes friction. Systems that reduce stress. Clarity that cancels noise. I'm talking about a way of thinking that doesn't leave room for doubt to multiply. Because it already has a job, a time, a place. You don't need to overhaul your life to feel this shift. It starts with the next plan you write down. The next 10 minutes you dedicate with full focus. The next habit you simplify instead of complicate. From that, momentum builds. And from that momentum, you no longer just survive the day, you direct it with strength and intentional calm. That's real freedom. And it's available now, not when your schedule clears, not when life slows down. Now, when you decide to put structure at the center of your mental economy. Now, when you choose discipline, not as punishment, but as the highest form of internal support, what you have to remember is this. Worry loves vagueness. It thrives on ambiguity. But it cannot survive specificity. The moment you give yourself clear next steps, worry loses power. Not because everything is solved, but because now you're solving, you're engaged. You're no longer paralyzed by what might happen, you're participating in what will. Don't underestimate the power of a short list. 3 priorities, 1 decision, 1 conversation you've been avoiding. These small, deliberate actions cut through the fog. They return you to the driver's seat. They prove to you again and again that anxiety shrinks in the face of aligned action. So if you're carrying worry, pause right now and ask, what's the next right thing? Not all the things, just the next one. And then take it, anchor your day around it. And when the noise comes back, as it always will remind yourself, structure dissolve confusion. And I control my structure. You got more power than you realize. Not because life will get easier, but because you'll get more deliberate. That's what cancels worry, not escape, but engagement. Not waiting, but choosing. And now that you know that, the next step is yours to take. Let's get to work.